Like, subscribe, and hype the video. Also, leave a comment on any topics you want to hear about in the future. Okay, let's dive in. In our last episode, we walked through the real story of Apollo 11, the engineering, the near disasters, the 30 seconds of fuel left at landing, and the scientific equipment still being used by researchers today. Today, we're going straight into the conspiracy theories. The Apollo hoax theory is one of the most widespread and longest-running conspiracy theories in modern history, with polls over the years suggesting that somewhere between 6 and 20% of Americans, and higher percentages in some other countries, have expressed doubt that the moon landings actually happened. Today, we're taking every major claim seriously, examining the actual evidence behind each one, and letting the facts speak for themselves. Let's go through them one by one. This is probably the single most commonly cited piece of supposed evidence for the hoax theory, and it's one of the easiest to resolve once you understand what's actually happening in the footage. The flag used on Apollo missions was specifically engineered with a horizontal rod sewn along the top edge, precisely because NASA engineers knew the flag would hang limp and invisible in the absence of any wind on the lunar surface. A straight, hanging flag photographs poorly and doesn't read as a flag at all in still images. The rod held the flag extended horizontally so it would be visible and recognizable in photographs and footage. What looks like waving in the footage is not wind moving the flag. It's the flag oscillating after being physically touched and rotated by the astronauts as they planted it into the lunar soil. In the vacuum of the moon, with no air resistance to dampen the motion, that oscillation continued for much longer after being disturbed than it would have on Earth, which is actually the opposite of what you'd expect from a faked environment. If the footage had been filmed in a studio with atmosphere, the flag would have stopped moving much faster. The prolonged oscillation is itself evidence of a vacuum environment, not a studio. Like, subscribe, and hype the video, and let's move to the next claim. Hoax theorists frequently point out that the Apollo photographs taken on the lunar surface show no stars in the sky, claiming this proves the photos were taken in a studio where a convincing star field backdrop couldn't be produced convincingly enough to include. This claim reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how camera exposure works, and it's something any photographer can test for themselves today with a smartphone. The lunar surface during the day is an extremely bright environment, sunlit regolith reflecting strong, unfiltered sunlight with no atmosphere to soften it. To properly expose a photograph of astronauts and equipment in that bright environment, a camera must use a fast shutter speed and small aperture, which correctly exposes the bright foreground subject but dramatically underexposes any faint background light sources like stars. Stars simply don't register in a correctly exposed daytime photograph, on Earth or on the moon. This is not a special effect or a gap in the cover-up. It's basic photography. You can test it right now. Go outside on a clear night, take a photo of a well-lit building or street, and check whether stars appear in that photo. They won't? The same physics that hides stars behind a well-lit building hides them behind a sunlit lunar landscape. This claim argues that the Van Allen belts, two zones of intense radiation surrounding Earth, trapped by our planet's magnetic field, would have delivered a lethal radiation dose to any astronauts passing through them, making the journey to the moon impossible without killing the crew. The Van Allen belts are real, and the radiation within them is genuinely hazardous. But the claim misrepresents both the nature of the belts and the actual trajectory NASA used. The Apollo spacecraft passed through the outer edges of the Van Allen belts on a trajectory specifically chosen to minimize exposure time and avoid the most intensely radioactive regions. The total passage time through the belts was roughly 30 minutes each way. NASA radiation physicists calculated the expected dose in advance, and the astronauts carried dosimeters, radiation measurement devices, throughout the mission that recorded the actual exposure received. The measured doses were significant but well within survivable limits, roughly equivalent to a few chest X-rays worth of exposure, far below the threshold for acute radiation sickness. In fact, the astronauts' actual measured radiation exposure was lower than many pre-mission estimates had predicted, because the specific trajectory chosen was effective at minimizing time in the highest intensity zones. Like, subscribe, and hype the video. And let's get to one of the more specific photographic claims. This is one of the more technically specific claims in the hoax theory. Apollo cameras had reticles, crosshair-like reference marks, etched directly onto the glass of the camera lens, meaning they should appear on top of everything in every photograph. Hoax theorists point to several Apollo photographs where these crosshairs appear to be partially hidden behind objects in the image, claiming this proves the photos were composited in a lab with the crosshairs added afterward over images that hadn't been properly aligned. The actual explanation is a well-understood photographic phenomenon called blooming, or overexposure bleed. When a bright white or highly reflective object sits immediately adjacent to or overlapping a thin dark crosshair line in a photograph, the overexposed brightness of the white object can bleed into and visually overwhelm the thin dark line in the film emulsion, making the crosshair appear to disappear behind the bright object. This effect is well documented in photography, entirely predictable given the extreme brightness contrast of the lunar environment, and produces exactly the kind of apparent crosshair disappearance seen in the photos being cited. No compositing required. Beyond addressing individual technical claims, there's a fundamental logical problem with the Apollo hoax theory that deserves direct attention: the scale of the cover-up it would require. The Apollo program employed over 400,000 people across NASA, its contractors, and its partner institutions at its peak. A successful faking of 6 moon landings, because Apollo 11 was not the only one, with 5 additional successful landings following it, would have required the coordinated, sustained silence of hundreds of thousands of people, across decades, spanning multiple presidential administrations, including administrations politically motivated to expose a deception by a previous administration. Many of these people have since died, and none has ever produced credible, documented evidence of a cover-up. Not one verifiable whistleblower, not one authenticated internal document, not one deathbed confession that held up to independent verification. Additionally, the Soviet Union was tracking the Apollo missions in real time using their own independent radar and communication systems, monitoring everything they could about the American space program throughout the space race. The Soviets had every geopolitical incentive to expose a faked moon landing. It would have been the most devastating propaganda victory of the entire Cold War. They never claimed the landings were faked. Soviet scientists acknowledged the achievement, and the Soviet space program went on to respond by pursuing their own robotic lunar sample return missions rather than contesting that the American landings occurred. Like, subscribe, and hype the video. And let's close with the single most straightforward piece of ongoing, independently verifiable evidence. Perhaps the most straightforward, most independently verifiable, and hardest to dismiss piece of evidence for the Apollo landings is the retroreflector arrays left on the lunar surface, the same ones we covered at the end of Episode 1. These retroreflectors, left at the Apollo 11, 14, and 15 landing sites, are used by observatories around the world on a regular basis, completely independent of NASA, to bounce laser pulses off the lunar surface and receive precisely timed reflections back. Any observatory with a sufficiently powerful laser and a precise enough detector can do this independently, and many have, including observatories in France, Italy, Germany, Japan, and multiple other countries with no stake in confirming American claims about what happened in 1969. The retroreflectors are demonstrably there. They're at specific locations. They return laser pulses with the exact timing and precision that physics predicts for objects at those locations on the lunar surface. If the Apollo landings were faked, these retroreflectors would somehow have to have been placed at their specific locations on the moon by some other means, and no alternative explanation for how they got there has ever been proposed that holds up to scrutiny. So here's where every major Apollo hoax claim actually lands when you examine the evidence carefully. The waving flag is explained by basic vacuum physics and deliberate engineering design. The missing stars are explained by basic camera exposure. The Van Allen belt claim misrepresents both the belt structure and the actual measured radiation dose the astronauts received. The crosshair anomaly is explained by well-understood photographic blooming. The cover-up would require the coordinated, decades-long silence of over 400,000 people, including the geopolitically motivated Soviet Union. And the retroreflectors left on the surface are still being pinged by independent international observatories today. The Apollo program happened 6 times. 12 human beings walked on another world, and the evidence they left behind is still actively generating scientific data more than 50 years later. Sometimes the most extraordinary thing in a story isn't the conspiracy. It's that the thing actually happened. If you've made it through both episodes, let me know in the comments whether anything changed your thinking. Like, subscribe, and hype the video, and I'll see you in the next one.